The most advanced supply chains of the ancient world ran through deserts of pure death. For thousands of years, silk, spices, and empires depended not on ships or roads, but on a hidden grid of remote desert. By the end of this story, you will understand how these forgotten oases built the first global economy. We will uncover how a single well in the sand could bankroll a kingdom, and why a caravanserai's walls held more than just merchants. How did a chain of tiny, vulnerable outposts keep continents connected for centuries? What does their silent legacy tell us about our own networked world? This challenge was not about a lack of will, but a simple, brutal fact of physics. A human being can only carry so much water. A loaded camel can travel only so far before it must drink. The distance between known oases was often a death sentence, a span of emptiness longer than any living thing could endure. So the first great transcontinental trade routes began not as lines on a map, but of questions. Where could you find one more day's worth of water? Where could your animals rest? Where could you store goods if a sandstorm forced you to halt for weeks? The staggering value of the goods in motion made answering these questions not just a matter of survival, but of empire. Roman senators paid their weight in gold for Chinese silk, a fabric so fine it was rumored to be woven from clouds. Temples from Egypt to India required vast quantities of frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins that grew only in a small corner of southern Arabia. The demand was immense and insatiable, creating a powerful economic pull that drew merchants toward the horizon. But the deserts between producer and consumer were not passive blanks on a map. They were active, consuming adversaries. Historian frames this early trade not as simple commerce, but as a form of geographical conquest. Each caravan that set out was attempting the impossible, a high-stakes experiment in logistics against an environment designed to erase all traces of passage. The solution, then, could not be a single road. It had to be something more resilient, a living, breathing network. The dream of a silk road or an incense trail could only become real if the desert itself could be made to support life, mile by grueling mile. This was the genesis of an idea so simple it was revolutionary. If a caravan could not carry enough to cross the void, then the void itself would have to provide. This network of life was built around a single, critical invention. Think of the ancient not as a simple rest stop, but as a beating heart. It was a deliberate, human-made organ implanted into the body of the desert, designed to pump the vital fluids of trade, water, security, and information into the fragile veins of the passing caravans. So what exactly made it different from a natural oasis or a permanent city? Its entire purpose was motion. While a city exists for its own people, it existed solely for those passing through. It was a machine for enabling travel. At its core, every true provided four essential functions. First, a secure caravanserai. This was a fortified enclosure, often with high walls and a single heavy gate, where hundreds of camels could be unloaded and penned safely for the night, protecting both the priceless goods and the exhausted merchants from the dangers of the open desert. Second, a guaranteed water source. This was not merely a natural spring. It was often a deepened well, a maintained cistern, or a complex underground channel known as a Qanat, tirelessly engineered to collect and preserve every precious drop. Without this, nothing else mattered. Third, it acted as a storage depot. If a caravan was too large, or if a merchant decided to wait for better market prices, they could leave sealed goods in the storerooms, trusting in its security, and continue on with a lighter load. Finally, many larger evolved into minor administrative posts and spontaneous markets. Here, local officials might collect tolls or ensure safe passage, while traders from opposite ends of the earth could briefly meet, exchange news of bandits or prices, and barter for supplies. The medieval traveler, who journeyed for 30 years, described the profound relief of finding such a haven. After weeks of silence and scorching wind, the sight of those walls meant safety, community, and a chance to hear another human voice. There was a microcosm of civilization, a tiny island of order imposed upon an ocean of wilderness. Its entire reason for being was to shrink the impossible distances between worlds. And to see how this concept truly worked, we must now journey to the places where these hearts beat the strongest. The most legendary of these desert hearts were the great oasis cities of the Silk Road. Places like and Samarkand were not just stops, they were the very engines of transcontinental exchange. To a caravan emerging from the blistering desert, the sight of its walls was a promise of life. But this was no simple watering hole, it was a dual gateway serving both the soul and the ledger. Just outside its walls, the caves were carved into a cliff face, becoming one of history's most astonishing libraries. Weary travelers, having survived the desert's trials, would commission a cave or donate a sutra, offering prayers for protection on the next lethal leg of their journey. This created a sacred repository where Buddhist, Taoist, and local traditions fused, a spiritual fuel station for the mercantile machine. Yet such a thriving hub could not exist on faith alone. Its physical survival was an engineering marvel. The secret was an underground network called the system. In the foothills of distant mountains, workers dug deep vertical shafts down to the water table, then connected them with gently sloping underground tunnels that channeled water for miles by gravity alone. This prevented evaporation in the searing heat, delivering a steady, life-giving flow to the orchards and fields of the oasis. It was a hidden, silent river beneath the sand, a technological masterpiece that transformed a potential into a self-sustaining agricultural powerhouse. These cities became supply nodes that could feed thousands of passing merchants and their animals, turning a bottleneck into a bounty. With survival assured, these oases blossomed into cosmopolitan crossroads. In Samarkand's bustling markets, a trader could broker a deal between a Chinese silk merchant and a Persian spice seller. A Nestorian Christian text might be next to a Zoroastrian fire altar, while Buddhist monks debated philosophy with scholars from India. This was not just trade in goods, but in ideas, languages, and art. They became a curator of culture, filtering and blending the traditions of a continent. This vibrant activity generated immense wealth, much of it collected as formal tariffs on goods. These funds paid for the soldiers who patrolled the surrounding dunes, the engineers who maintained and the officials who kept complex trade records. The oasis was not a passive beneficiary of the Silk Road. It was its active guardian and banker, investing in the security and infrastructure that made the next caravan's journey possible. It was a living, breathing entity that grew rich by facilitating the flow of everything around it. But while the Silk Road's oases are famous, another desert network operated on a logic of pure, distilled necessity, where the stakes of a mist were absolute. While the Silk Road thrived on cultural exchange, another desert network operated on a principle of pure monopoly. In the bone-dry highlands of southern Arabia, a tree produced a substance worth more than gold by weight. This was frankincense, the aromatic resin that perfumed temples and royal courts from Rome to Babylon. Harvested from scraggly trees in the remote Dhofar region, it began a perilous 2-month journey northward, carried by camel trains toward the Mediterranean ports like. The route was a brutal furnace, crossing the Rub al, the empty quarter, one of the most waterless places on earth. Here, the value of the cargo was matched only by the lethality of the landscape, creating a trade so valuable it had to be invented from nothing. The masters of this impossible logistics chain were They understood that in a land defined by absolute scarcity, control did not mean owning the desert, but owning the points where life was possible. Their kingdom was not built on territory, but on a meticulously planned string of. At the heart of this network was the legendary city of Petra, but its true power lay in the smaller, fortified outposts and that dotted the route. These were not welcoming cosmopolitan hubs, but highly efficient, defensible supply depots. Archaeologists studying these sites note their strategic placement, often tucked into cliffs or atop mesas, invisible until you were upon them. This served a dual purpose. It protected the precious cargo from raiders, and just as crucially, it guarded the most valuable asset, the secret knowledge of where the next well was located. Their dominance was not military but hydrological. They were geniuses of water capture in a rainless world. At a place they constructed vast, plaster-lined cisterns to catch the scant seasonal runoff. They carved intricate channels across cliff faces to funnel every drop into reservoirs. A single might hold enough water to supply a large caravan for weeks, a treasure more immediate and vital than the incense it served. This command over the basic ingredient of life allowed them to impose tolls, set prices, and dictate terms. They did not just facilitate the incense trade, they were the incense trade. Every merchant was utterly dependent on their hidden wells and fortified shelters. From this mastery of necessity, they built a wealthy, powerful kingdom that even the Roman Empire eventually had to negotiate with, proving that in the ancient world, the true power often lay not in the destination, but in the carefully managed spaces in between. The scale of the Saharan trade defies comprehension. Imagine a slow-moving river of 10,000 camels, a caravan so vast its dust cloud could be seen for days, inching across an ocean of sand for 2 months straight. This was the reality of the Trans-Saharan network, a supply chain built on a stark, elemental exchange. In the south, in kingdoms like Ghana and Mali, gold was so plentiful it was used by the elite for decoration. In the north, across the Mediterranean, empires minted coins and paid armies with it. But between them lay the Sahara, a barrier so absolute it could only be crossed by turning the desert's own deadly scarcity into a commodity. The key was salt. Mined from vast deposits in the central Sahara, compressed into heavy, translucent slabs, salt was more precious than gold in the humid, salt-starved regions of West Africa, where it was essential for preserving food and sustaining life. The entire economy pivoted on this simple, brutal equation. That made this exchange possible were not just stops, they were the fulcrum upon which continents balanced. To survive the crossing, caravans depended on a precise geography of salvation. At the northern edge of the desert, towns like in Morocco were the final emporiums of the Mediterranean world. Here, goods were assembled, camels were purchased and fattened, and the massive caravans, sometimes numbering in the thousands of animals, were organized. From there, the route plunged into the void, guided by the stars and by the deep, ancestral knowledge of Tuareg nomads. These nomadic guides were the living infrastructure of the route. They knew the location of every hidden well, every patch of forage, and every treacherous dune sea. Their loyalty was purchased with tolls paid in salt or cloth, and their expertise was the difference between fortune and a forgotten grave. They themselves took a unique form known as a Kaysar, a fortified village of connected mud-brick dwellings rising from the pre-Saharan plains. These were not welcoming inns, but austere, defensible strongholds where water was guarded and travelers could shelter from both the sun and potential raiders. After weeks of this harsh transit, the southern terminus was a place of legend. Timbuktu began as a simple seasonal camp around a well used by Tuareg herders. Its location at the precise meeting point of desert and river made it the inevitable trading floor. Here, in the shadow of its later famous mosques and universities, the silent bargaining took place. The process was one of deliberate, ritualized trust. North African merchants would lay out their slabs of salt and other goods. West African gold traders would then approach and place a pile of gold dust beside them. Neither group spoke directly, often communicating through a silent intermediary. They would adjust their piles back and forth until both parties were satisfied, then depart without a word. They provided the neutral, secure ground for this wordless transaction that fueled kingdoms. But Timbuktu's legacy reveals the deeper function of these hubs. The wealth generated by the salt for gold trade did not just buy luxury, it funded an astonishing intellectual revolution. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu had become a center of Islamic scholarship rivaling any in the world. Its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and poetry, and studied by scholars drawn to this remote oasis. The born from sheer logistical necessity had matured into a university town, a beacon of learning that shone precisely because it was a crossroads. The desert supply chain did more than move weight, it carried ideas, transforming a mercantile node into a cradle of civilization. This incredible network, however, faced a universal threat, a silent failure that could unravel the entire system in a matter of seasons. Yet for all their strategic brilliance, these networks possessed a single, universal point of failure. The entire system depended on a resource that could vanish without warning. A single season of drought, a single collapsed well, or a shift in the water table could turn a vital into a ghost town, severing a continental supply chain in a matter of months. The architects of these desert outposts understood this intimately. Their greatest challenge was not building walls to keep people out, but engineering miracles to keep the life-giving element in. To survive, they had to become masters of defying the desert's fundamental nature. The architectural genius of it was not measured in grandeur, but in its quiet, relentless battle against evaporation and heat. The primary building material was often the earth itself, transformed. Thick walls of sun-baked mud brick, sometimes mixed with straw for strength, provided more than just security. They acted as a natural thermal mass, absorbing the fierce heat of the day and slowly releasing a gentle warmth during the freezing desert nights, creating a stable, habitable environment inside. The layout followed a ruthlessly practical logic. A typical caravanserai was built as a square or rectangular fortress with a single, heavy gate. Inside, a vast central courtyard allowed for the unloading and tethering of hundreds of camels and pack animals. Along the walls, a shaded arcade provided merchants with simple sleeping quarters and space for their personal goods, while secure, vaulted storerooms held the trade commodities. Every element served the flow of goods and the preservation of life, but the true heart of the structure, its reason for being, was always hidden from view. It lay beneath the sand. The most profound engineering marvel was the Qanat system, a technology so effective it shaped empires. In the highlands of Persia, teams of skilled diggers, known as, would locate a water-bearing layer in the foothills. They would then dig a vertical shaft down to this aquifer, but one well was not enough. They would dig a second shaft some distance downhill, and then a third and a fourth, connecting them at the bottom with a gently sloping underground tunnel. This chain of hidden shafts and tunnels, sometimes stretching for dozens of miles, used gravity alone to guide water from the mountain source to the arid plains below. The vertical shafts provided air and allowed for maintenance, while the covered tunnel prevented the precious water from evaporating under the scorching sun. It was a man-made underground river, a silent, invisible lifeline. A single Qanat could transform a barren patch of desert into a fertile oasis, capable of supporting a caravanserai, its gardens, and all passing traffic. This was not crude construction. It was advanced civil engineering requiring precise understanding of hydrology, geology, and surveying. The builders had to calculate the exact slope. Too steep and the water would erode the tunnel, too shallow and it would stagnate. They mapped the subterranean landscape with an accuracy that still impresses modern engineers. Beyond the Qanat, every drop was cherished. Vast, plaster-lined cisterns were carved into bedrock or built underground to capture and store seasonal rainwater. In some coastal deserts, like the Negev, ingenious systems of stone piles and channels were designed to capture minuscule amounts of moisture from fog and dew, channeling it to the roots of plants. It was, in essence, a machine for harvesting water from a seemingly waterless world. These were not random shelters thrown up by desperate travelers. They were the product of generations of accumulated knowledge, centers of applied science, where the mastery of physics and environment directly translated into economic and political power. The quiet hum of a working Qanat was the sound of a continent staying connected. The silent failure of a single well was the nightmare every caravan leader carried in their heart. Picture a column of 200 camels, their loads of silk or incense worth a king's ransom, arriving at the mapped coordinates after 8 days in the blistering void. The scouts rush ahead, only to return with dust on their lips and terror in their eyes. The well is dry, not low, not brackish, but completely empty, a stone-lined shaft descending into nothing but hot, dead air. In that moment, the entire precarious enterprise of transcontinental trade hung by a thread. The value of the goods meant nothing. The strength of the guards was irrelevant. Without water, every living thing in that caravan had perhaps 3 days left. This stark reality is why water was not just a resource in these networks. It was the only true currency, and its management was a sacred, militarized science. The protocols for finding and securing water were as precise and unyielding as the desert sun. Before a caravan even departed, its leaders would send runners or pay nomadic guides for intelligence on the condition of every well along the intended route. This information was more valuable than any map. Upon reaching the first and only task was water procurement. Deep wells, often dug down 50 meters or more to reach the fossil water table, were the lifelines. Their maintenance was a communal duty enforced by strict law. Ancient travelogues and legal codes from across the desert world are filled with specific, severe penalties for damaging these vital sources. A text from the kingdom might stipulate a heavy fine in livestock for allowing an animal to fall into a well and foul it. In Islamic legal traditions that governed many later trade routes, polluting a public well was considered a grave offense against the entire community. The message was universal: the well's purity was inviolable. Once drawn, water entered a highly regulated system of distribution. It was hauled up in heavy leather buckets, then transferred to storage. The primary vessels were large, porous ceramic jars called amphorae in the Mediterranean world, or the iconic animal skin bags, known as water skins, treated with oils to make them watertight. These skins could be loaded onto camels or donkeys for the next leg of the journey, but their capacity was always agonizingly limited. This scarcity bred meticulously fair and often ruthless social rules. At a busy, access to the well was strictly queued, often based on the size of one's caravan and the tolls paid. A lone traveler might receive a single skinful, while a merchant prince could water 50 camels, but only in a designated order to prevent a chaotic, water-wasting stampede. Disputes were settled immediately by this master, whose authority derived entirely from his control over the spigot. His word was law because he held life in his hands. This constant vigilance transformed from a simple stop into a hydrological fortress. The guaranteed supply was not an accident, but the product of relentless labor. Teams of workers, often slaves or paid laborers from local tribes, were dedicated to the well's depth and the cleanliness of its surrounding catchment area. They cleared sand drifts, repaired stone linings, and monitored the water level with marked ropes. In some systems, a special official, a kind of ancient water warden, was appointed solely to manage allocation and prevent theft. The entire economic and social structure of the place existed to perform one function: to transform a geological accident of underground water into a reliable, measured commodity for sale. The tolls collected here were not merely taxes on trade, they were payments for life itself, measured cup by precious cup. This absolute dependence on managed water created a unique form of power, one that was both fragile and immense. It raises a profound question. What happened when the guardians of these oases faced not a natural drought, but a deliberate human threat? When the security of the walls was tested not by the environment, but by those who sought to take its treasure by force, the master of a desert held a title of quiet, absolute power. He was the keeper of the gates, the guardian of the well, and the final word in a land with no other law. This figure could be many things: a government official appointed by a distant sultan, a respected elder from a local nomadic tribe, or the patriarch of a family that had turned a simple stop into a generational business. His authority did not come from a crown or a sword, but from a simple, unshakable fact: everyone who passed through his gates was utterly dependent on him for their survival. His day began before dawn, overseeing the opening of the heavy wooden gates as the first caravans prepared to depart into the cool morning air. His staff, a mix of family members, hired guards, and skilled laborers, moved with a practiced rhythm. Some would be drawing water, checking the levels in the cisterns with marked poles. Others would be sweeping out the animal pens in the central courtyard, or repairing a section of sun-baked mud wall damaged by a recent windstorm. In the kitchen, a simple but vital operation was baking dense, long-lasting flatbreads in clay ovens and preparing vast communal pots of stew, often made from lentils, dried meat, and whatever hardy vegetables could be cultivated in the oasis gardens. This food was not a luxury, it was fuel sold to travelers who had exhausted their own supplies. The master himself would then take his seat, often in a shaded alcove near the gate, to begin his true work. As caravans arrived, dusty and exhausted, he was the first point of contact. He assessed the size of the train, counted the animals, and levied the toll, a tax paid in coin, in a percentage of goods, or sometimes in the very salt or cloth being carried. This toll was the lifeblood of the paying for guards, well diggers, and supplies, but his role went far beyond tax collector. He was the chief mediator. Disputes between merchants from different cultures, complaints about stolen goods, or conflicts over watering order all landed before him. His judgment had to be swift, fair, and respected, for chaos at it could mean death for everyone. Perhaps his most critical function was that of intelligence officer. He absorbed every piece of information that came through his gates. Which routes were safe, which passes were blocked by sand, where were bandits rumored to be active, what were the current prices for silk in Samarkand or gold in Timbuktu. This curated stream of news was a commodity he could share or sell, making his a nerve center in a vast, silent network. His family lived within those same walls, their lives intertwined with the endless cycle of arrivals and departures. Children grew up learning to gauge the health of a camel at a glance and to understand fragments of a dozen languages. The master's wife often managed the crucial hospitality, overseeing the cooking and the allocation of sleeping quarters, a role that required immense diplomatic skill. Their knowledge was not written in books, it was etched into memory, the exact feeling of the wind that foretold a sandstorm, the subtle change in the well water's taste that signaled a sinking water table. The recognized call of a friendly scout versus the alarm cry for raiders. This expertise, born from a lifetime of observation, was what made the system work. The master was the indispensable human algorithm, processing the variables of survival and commerce in real time. His outpost was not just a place, it was a function he performed, and his continued existence proved the route was open. But this position of trusted authority also created a unique vulnerability, one that invited a very specific kind of betrayal. What happened when the keeper of the gate was not a guardian, but a predator in disguise? The heavy gates of a swung open not just to shelter, but to a carefully calculated exchange. Every camel that crossed that threshold, every bale of silk or sack of spice, represented potential revenue for the Oasis and the powers that controlled it. The moment a caravan master presented himself to the station's keeper, a silent negotiation began, one that funded the entire operation. The keeper or his appointed toll collector would walk the line of weary animals, his eyes expertly appraising the loads. He was not merely counting, he was classifying. Was that bundle fine Chinese silk, subject to a 10% add tax, or a heavier load of commonplace cotton, taxed at a lower rate? Were those ceramic jars filled with precious incense resin or cheaper oil? This assessment was a skill in itself, often backed by the threat of inspection. The resulting toll could be paid in coin from a distant mint, in a measured weight of silver, or most commonly, in a portion of the goods themselves. A merchant might surrender one slab of salt out of 20, or a single bolt of cloth from his load. This was the lifeblood of the. The collected tolls paid the wages of the guards who patrolled the walls, the laborers who tirelessly cleared sand from the well, and the craftsmen who repaired the gates. It purchased the grain to feed the station's own staff, and the fodder sold to travelers for their animals. Without this steady stream of resources, the walls would crumble and the well would silt over, severing the link in the chain. But this system served a purpose far beyond mere maintenance. For a local ruler or a regional governor, the toll was a powerful lever of political and economic control. By setting the tariff rates, a ruler could encourage or discourage certain goods, funnel trade through specific routes he controlled, and amass a treasury without ever setting foot in the desert. Control the water, control the fort, and you controlled the wealth of continents as it passed by your door. This transformed from a passive service into an active instrument of statecraft, a customs house in the wilderness. Yet within those same walls, a far more dynamic and spontaneous economy was also born. Once the official tolls were settled and the animals were stabled, the real energy of the place ignited. The caravan merchants, now temporary residents, became eager buyers. Local farmers from the Oasis gardens would arrive with baskets of fresh dates, pomegranates, and onions, a vibrant luxury after weeks of dried rations. Herders offered goats or chickens for slaughter. Craftsmen set up impromptu workshops in the courtyard, repairing torn saddles, reshoeing camels, or stitching damaged leather water bags. A vibrant barter economy would spring to life, with spices from India traded for felt hats from Central Asia, or glass beads from Egypt exchanged for dried fruit. This microeconomy made the self-sustaining. The caravan did not just consume resources, it injected wealth directly into the local community, which in turn produced the very supplies the next caravan would need. The station became a pulsating economic junction, a temporary marketplace where value was constantly being reassigned and recreated. For a few days, this remote outpost in the absolute middle of nowhere would hum with the activity of a thriving town, a testament to trade's power to generate life in the most unexpected places. This constant flow of goods and currency, however, created an irresistible target, attracting not just merchants and farmers, but also those who sought to take wealth without offering anything in return. The promise of safety within those walls was a product sold as deliberately as water. For the merchants resting in the courtyard, the high perimeter was not just architecture, it was a psychological shield. These walls, often towering 3 or 4 times the height of a person, were built from the desert itself, thick layers of sun-baked mud brick that could blunt the force of a sandstorm and deter a raiding party. Strategically placed watchtowers at each corner offered sentries an unobstructed view for miles across the flat, empty terrain, turning thee into a vigilant eye in the wilderness. The single, heavy gate was the ultimate choke point, wide enough for a loaded camel to pass, but fortified with iron studs and secured by a massive crossbar at night. This design served a brutal logic. It forced every arrival and departure into a controlled, observable funnel, making surprise impossible. The station's reputation for this impregnability was its most valuable asset. Caravan masters consulted each other like modern travelers checking reviews, sharing which routes were patrolled and which keepers maintained the most reliable guards. A single rumor of a compromised outpost could reroute trade for an entire season, starving a dishonest keeper of the tolls that were his lifeblood. Security was not an optional service, it was the foundational guarantee upon which the entire economy of movement depended. This guarantee extended beyond the walls. The most dangerous stretches were the silent miles between one fortified island and the next. To bridge this gap, a specialized profession emerged, the caravan guard. These were not soldiers of a standing army, but more often hired mercenaries from local nomadic tribes who knew the land intimately. A keeper might broker their services, connecting a wealthy merchant train with a band of proven fighters. Their payment was a share of the profits or a flat fee, and their presence was a clear signal. A line of armed riders flanking a camel train was a deterrent as much as a defense, broadcasting that an attack would be costly. These guards were masters of desert warfare, skilled with bows and spears, and capable of navigating by the stars as well as any merchant. They understood that their role was not to win battles, but to avoid them entirely, using their knowledge to steer caravans away from known ambush sites and through the most defensible passes. Their very existence turned the empty desert from a lawless void into a space with rules, however harsh, enforced by the threat of steel. Yet the desert itself was often a more relentless adversary than any human bandit. This design was a direct response to this environmental hostility. Those same thick walls that stopped arrows also created a profound thermal buffer. Inside the courtyard, the temperature could be 10 or 15 degrees cooler than the searing outside air, a life-saving difference during the midday inferno. The shaded arcades provided refuge from the sun, while the enclosed design broke the punishing wind that could whip sand into a flesh-scouring blast. When a sandstorm did descend, the entire caravan would huddle inside, the great gate sealed against the roaring, particulate fog outside. For days, business would halt as the world beyond the walls vanished into a tan haze, but within, there was relative calm. The station's storerooms held the emergency reserves of grain and water to wait out the storm, a testament to planning for nature's unpredictability. This dual purpose, protection from both man and elements, made a true oasis in every sense. It was a bubble of managed order where the rules of the outside, lethal world were temporarily suspended. The toll paid at the gate was, in essence, an insurance premium, purchasing a temporary exemption from the desert's harsh sovereignty. This intricate system of mutual dependence between merchant, guard, and keeper created a fragile but resilient order. Yet it was an order perpetually shadowed by its own inherent temptations. The very concentration of wealth and trust that made the system function also planted the seeds for its most insidious form of corruption. The courtyard at dusk was a symphony of survival. As the last of the sun's heat bled from the mud brick walls, the true work of the began, not in the merchant's quarters, but among the animals. The low grumbling of camels, the snort of horses, and the braying of donkeys filled the air, a chorus of exhaustion. These creatures were not merely beasts of burden, they were the living, breathing engines of transcontinental trade. A single camel could carry hundreds of pounds for 25 miles a day, but its health was as fragile as a ceramic water jar. The entire enterprise, the silk, the spices, the gold, all of it depended entirely on the strength of their legs and the steadiness of their hearts. This made the far more than a hotel. It was a specialized veterinary clinic and a repair depot for the most complex machinery of the ancient world. The staff moved with practiced urgency. Young boys hauled bundles of dry, thorny scrub and precious alfalfa from shaded storerooms, distributing the fodder into long stone troughs. Water bearers made their endless trips from the well to the drinking basins, knowing a dehydrated animal was a dead one. But the most respected figures were the animal handlers, men and women whose knowledge was passed down through generations. They possessed an intuitive diagnostic skill, running their hands along a camel's flank to feel for dehydration, checking a horse's hooves for cracks, or looking into a donkey's eyes for signs of profound fatigue. Their expertise addressed the unique ailments of desert travel. Sand colic was a constant danger for camels, where ingested sand could block their gut, causing agonizing distress. The treatment might involve a carefully administered draught of oil or a specific mixture of herbs to help pass the obstruction. For horses and donkeys, whose hooves could split on sharp rocks, this blacksmith was as vital as its keeper. The ringing of his hammer shaping hot iron into custom shoes was a sound of profound reassurance, signaling that the journey could continue. Every element of the facility was designed for this biological maintenance. Separate, shaded resting areas allowed animals to recover away from the bustling central yard. Smooth stone flooring in the stables prevented hoof injuries. Storage rooms were kept cool and dry to preserve fodder from rot and insects. This was applied science on a grand scale. The handlers knew which local plants could be used as poultices for saddle sores, how to mix salt licks to replenish lost minerals, and the precise way to brace a donkey's sprained leg with strips of leather and wood. Their success rate was a matter of economic life and death. A merchant who lost half his camels to illness in the middle of the desert stood to lose everything: cargo, profit, and often his own life. The ability of to nurse a caravan's animals back to health after a brutal leg of the journey was its most valuable, and often most expensive, service. This transformed the stop from a passive pause into an active participant in the journey's success. The handlers were not just caretakers, they were logistical partners, recalibrating the very means of motion. As the animals settled into their recovery, another form of essential maintenance was taking place just a few paces away, one that dealt not in flesh and bone, but in information and trust. While the animals rested and goods were repaired, the most vital commodity of all was being exchanged in whispers and sealed scrolls. A merchant huddled in the corner of a caravanserai courtyard was not just sharing a meal, he was downloading the latest market data from a continent away. In its ultimate evolution, became the router of the ancient world, a node in a vast, slow-moving internet where information traveled at the speed of a camel. This was not a side effect of trade, it was its central nervous system. The most famous organized version of this was the Persian Royal Road, an administrative marvel stretching over 1,600 miles. Its true genius was not the road itself, but the 111 relay stations built along it. At each station, a fresh horse and a dedicated courier waited day and night. A message from the king could leap from one end of the empire to the other in a week, a speed unimaginable for ordinary travel. This system turned geography into administration, allowing a central authority to project its will across deserts and mountains with startling efficiency. Centuries later, the Mongol Empire perfected this model with the Yam, a network of that spanned from the Pacific to the borders of Europe. Here, not only horses but food, shelter, and guides were guaranteed for authorized messengers carrying the golden, a passport of supreme authority. A rider with a could demand a fresh horse at any Yam station, allowing him to cover up to 200 miles in a single day, relaying news of rebellions, military victories, or diplomatic offers across 12,000 miles of steppe and desert. This was the logistics of empire, running on a subscription service of speed and reliability. But for the everyday merchant, the information network was more informal, yet just as critical. The Caravanserai was a live news feed. Over a shared pot of tea, a trader just in from India might report that the price of pepper had plummeted in Gujarat due to a bumper harvest. A guard, swapping stories with another, might mention seeing smoke on the horizon near a certain pass, a possible sign of bandit activity. A pilgrim could bring word of a new ruler in Baghdad, whose customs officials were demanding higher bribes. This constant, gossip-fueled stream of intelligence allowed merchants to make real-time decisions. Do I sell my silk here, or carry it further west where the price is rumored to be better? Do I take the northern route this season, or is the southern one safer? The reduction of this profound uncertainty was perhaps the greatest gift to commerce. It helped synchronize markets that had no other connection. A demand for cobalt blue dye in Cairo could, within a few months, trigger increased production in the mines of Afghanistan, because the news of that demand traveled back along the same chain. A personal letter, entrusted to a caravan master known to be heading toward a specific city, was the ancient equivalent of an email, taking months to deliver but carrying the emotional weight of a voice across the void. This flow of words and numbers transformed from a mere service plaza into a living database. The keeper of the station was often its most knowledgeable node, a man who remembered which merchant was trustworthy, which route was currently clear, and what the last caravan from the south had paid for wool. His memory was the server, and every new arrival was an update. In this light, the desert supply chain was carrying something even more valuable than silk or gold. It was carrying the knowledge necessary for the system to perpetuate itself. This delicate web of trust and information, however, could not survive the arrival of a new kind of network, one that moved not at the pace of hoofbeats, but at the speed of the wind. A merchant might trade silk for spices, but he would carry home something far more transformative, a new idea. The true cargo of the desert networks was not measured in bales or coins, but in the beliefs, stories, and knowledge exchanged in the firelight of 1,000 remote courtyards. These, by their very nature, became the world's most unsanctioned and vibrant universities. Picture a scene in a caravanserai near. A Chinese Buddhist monk, having traversed to collect sacred texts from India, is collaborating with a trader who speaks both Chinese and Sanskrit. Together, by the flicker of an oil lamp, they work through a difficult passage of a sutra, the trader providing a rough verbal translation, which the monk then renders into elegant classical Chinese characters. This was not a royal academy, it was a spontaneous, necessity-driven workshop of faith. The translated text would be, and left in the nearby caves, enriching that great library before both men moved on, carrying the refined doctrine further along the chain. In a similar vein, within the mud brick walls of a Saharan Qaisar, the night's conversation after a salt caravan's arrival might turn from prices to philosophy. A Muslim scholar from Fez, traveling to Timbuktu, could find himself in deep debate with a local Malian imam about a point of Islamic law. Their discussion, informed by different schools of thought that had blossomed a continent apart. The shared hardship of the journey leveled social barriers, creating a rare space for dialogue between people who would never have met in their settled lives. This constant, informal exchange acted as a cultural filter and a blender. Religious beliefs were particularly mobile. Buddhism spread from India to Central Asia, China, and beyond, its iconography subtly changing as it passed through Persian and Hellenistic-influenced regions, with the Buddha's robes taking on new artistic forms. Nestorian Christianity found its way along the Silk Road to China, while Islam moved peacefully into West Africa, not primarily through conquest, but through the patient conversations of merchants and scholars at desert trading posts. Artistic motifs traveled just as freely. A decorative pattern from a Greek vase, carried east on a trader's memory, might reappear centuries later in the wall paintings of a Central Asian Buddhist temple. The brilliant cobalt blue, developed by Persian chemists, became the defining color of Chinese porcelain, creating a demand that further fueled the mineral trade from Afghanistan. Even the humble evening meal was a site of fusion. A cook in a Pamir Mountains might learn to use black pepper from India, while a recipe for noodles could slowly migrate from China westward, evolving with each new kitchen it entered. There was a crucible where civilizations did not clash, but quietly simmered together, their most durable elements dissolving into the broth of a shared human experience. This slow, person-to-person transmission of culture created a connected world long before the concept of globalization existed. Yet this entire intricate, living system was built on a foundation of profound fragility, silently waiting for the moment the balance would tip. The true price of a bolt of silk was measured not only in gold, but in the calloused hands that made its journey possible. Within the walls of a strict social hierarchy operated, a microcosm of the ancient world itself. At the very foundation of this hierarchy was a workforce whose names are almost entirely absent from the Grand Chronicles, yet whose daily toil was the absolute prerequisite for everything else. Enslaved individuals formed a core part of this labor force in many cultures and eras. Their roles were brutally specific and essential. They were the ones sent down into the dark, suffocating depths of the well to clear silt and repair stone linings, a terrifying and dangerous task. They manned the relentless treadmill of hauling endless leather buckets of water to the troughs. They cleared the animal pens of waste and carried the heavy sacks of fodder from storage. Their lives were defined by repetitive, physically crushing tasks that ensured the station's basic functions never ceased. Alongside them worked hired local porters, often from nearby nomadic or settled communities. These men were the human cranes of the operation. When a caravan arrived, they swarmed the loaded camels, expertly balancing bales of silk or slabs of salt on their shoulders to carry them into the secure storerooms. Their knowledge of efficient packing and knot tying was a specialized skill that prevented costly damage to goods. They worked for daily wages, often paid in kind with food or cloth, their economic existence precarious but vital to the rapid turnover the trade demanded. Then there were the skilled artisans, the technicians of the road. The blacksmith's forge was a hub of constant activity, its heat a stark contrast to the night's chill. He did not just shoe horses. He repaired metal fittings on harnesses, sharpened tools, and reforged broken weapon tips for guards. The saddle maker, working with leather cured in the dry air, patched tears and restitched padding, his work directly affecting the comfort and health of the animals. Even the cooks were logistical experts. To feed hundreds of people with no notice required profound skill. They managed stores of grain, lentils, and dried meat, transforming them into vast, hearty stews in enormous clay pots. They baked flatbreads by the hundred, timing their production to the arrival and departure of caravans. This unseen human machinery operated on a rhythm separate from the merchants' negotiations. Their world was one of tangible, immediate problems: a leaking water skin, a lame camel, a hungry traveler. While the merchant dealt in abstract future profits, these workers dealt in the urgent present of strained muscles and dwindling supplies. Their collective effort, often overlooked, was the true grease in the gears. It was the porter's strength that prevented a precious vase from shattering, the cook's foresight that staved off hunger, and the well-digger's courage that kept the water flowing. To understand thee is to see it not just as an architectural feat, but as a social organism, one that required every layer of its community to function. This complex, often harsh human ecosystem thrived only as long as the goods kept moving, a reality that would soon face a challenge no amount of labor could overcome. The desert offered no signs, only the endless, shifting grammar of sand and stone. To cross it required a literacy few possessed, a mastery of the silent language written in the stars above and the earth below. This was not a skill learned from maps, but absorbed through a lifetime of walking, watching, and listening. The caravan guide was the ultimate navigator, a human compass whose mind held a three-dimensional chart of a world that appeared blank to everyone else. His primary text was the night sky. In the absolute darkness of the desert, far from any haze of civilization, the stars blazed with a clarity that felt almost physical. The guide knew them not as distant points of light, but as a rotating clock and a fixed compass. The North Star, Polaris, provided the constant, unwavering reference for true north. But the real artistry came in reading the other constellations, watching their slow wheel through the night to mark the passing hours, and to confirm direction when the pole star was obscured. This celestial knowledge was precise, practical, and often intertwined with poetry, with star patterns named for animals or objects that told stories of the land beneath them. Yet the sky was only half the story. By day, the guide read the desert floor like a book. To an outsider, one dune looked exactly like another, an endless repetition of form. To the guide, each was distinct. He recognized the specific shape of a Barkhan dune, its crescent horns pointing downwind, and understood what its formation said about prevailing storms. A particular outcrop of dark, weathered basalt might serve as a critical turning point, a cairn built by nature itself. He watched the way the wind scoured patterns into a rock face, or how certain hardy plants clustered in a dry wash, indicating a place where water might lie closer to the surface after a rare rain. These were not dramatic landmarks, but subtle, almost whispered clues. The path was a sequence of these clues, a memorized chain of visual triggers. Follow the ridge until you see the 3 stacked stones that look like a sleeping camel. Then turn toward the distant mountain that has a notch like an arrowhead. And continue until the color of the sand changes from pale gold to a reddish hue. This was the oral tradition, the living map. It was never written down because its value was too great. The precise coordinates of a hidden well, the safest path through a canyon of soft sand, the location of a seasonal grazing patch. This knowledge was a form of wealth more secure than gold. It was passed carefully from master to apprentice, often within a single family or a trusted tribe over generations. A father would walk with his son, pointing out the barely perceptible signs, testing his memory on the return journey. Stories and songs were used as mnemonic devices, encoding roots into verse that could be recalled around a fire. This made certain groups, like the Tuareg of the Sahara or the Bedouin of the Arabian deserts, the indispensable to the entire system. Their expertise was not a service, it was a strategic monopoly. A merchant could own all the silk in China, but without a guide from a tribe that controlled the knowledge of the wells, his wealth was meaningless dust. The guide was the original proprietary software, a living, breathing GPS whose continual updates came from lived experience. This profound dependency on human memory created a system of extraordinary resilience and terrifying fragility. What happened when that living library, that chain of oral tradition, was broken? The answer lies not in a sandstorm, but in a silent, fundamental shift in how the world itself decided to move. The resilience of these human networks was perpetually tested by a far greater force, the Earth's own shifting moods. A existence was a fragile equilibrium, a truce negotiated daily with a climate that held all the power. A single generation of reduced rainfall, a gradual shift in wind patterns, or one catastrophic storm could unravel a century of careful engineering, turning a vital node into a ghost town buried in silence. The desert was not a static backdrop, it was an active participant, and its changes wrote the final chapter for countless outposts. Across the Sahara, archaeologists have identified the haunting remains of that now sit dozens of miles from any possible water source. These were not victims of poor planning, but of a creeping enemy, desertification. The subtle climate shift might have begun with a few decades of slightly less reliable monsoon rains at the desert's southern edge. The water table would slowly sink, beyond the reach of the deepest well. The hardy grasses that stabilized the dunes would wither, allowing the sand to become mobile. A once reliable spring would shrink to a muddy trickle, then vanish entirely. The community would fight back, digging the well deeper, building longer catchment channels to capture every drop of runoff. But there was a limit. When the cost of sustaining life outweighed the tolls from passing trade, the agonizing decision was made. The station would be abandoned, its remaining timber and usable stone carried away, leaving the empty shells of buildings to be sculpted by the wind. In other places, the end was not a slow retreat but a sudden interment. On the edges of the desert, known as the Sea of Death, shifting dune fields could swallow a small caravanserai whole in a season of exceptional storms. A merchant traveling a familiar route might arrive to find only a smooth, unbroken slope of sand where the gates once stood, a tomb for the last caravan that never made it out. These silent disasters are preserved in the archaeological record, layers of wind-blown silt separating moments of vibrant life from absolute stillness. Yet human ingenuity constantly pushed back against this entropy. Adaptation was the core skill. When a water source failed, the entire station might be moved, a few miles down a valley to a new seepage point, the old walls cannibalized for building material. This created a drifting geography of trade, where the route itself was a living entity, bending and shifting like a river seeking a new course. In the Negev desert, researchers have found evidence of that were deliberately rebuilt multiple times on slightly different alignments. Each iteration refining the water capture systems based on hard-learned lessons from the last drought. The knowledge of how to adapt was itself a cargo carried from station to station. A technique for reinforcing a well against collapse, developed in the Persian highlands, might slowly diffuse along the trade routes, shared between engineers in a dozen languages. This collective, slow-motion problem-solving is what gave the network its astonishing longevity, stretching not for years, but for. It was a battle fought not with swords, but with shovels and patience, a testament to the stubborn human refusal to let the lines of connection be severed. Yet this centuries-long struggle against nature was ultimately a prelude to a far more decisive change, one that did not come from the shifting sands, but from a fundamental reimagining of how the world could be connected. The fate of A was never written in stone, but in the shifting currents of human ambition and the relentless patience of the sand. For every oasis that thrived for centuries, another slowly faded from memory, its walls dissolving back into the landscape from which they were carved. Their disappearance was rarely a single event, but a slow unraveling of the delicate threads that had once bound continents together. The most decisive cut often came not from the desert, but from the sea. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer successfully sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, reaching the lucrative spice markets of India by ocean. This single voyage did not immediately end the desert caravans, but it began a slow, century-long siphoning of wealth. Sea transport, while perilous, could move vastly greater quantities of goods at a lower cost per pound than a train of 10,000 camels. The economic gravity that had pulled trade through the heart of deserts began to shift toward the coastlines. Over time, the caravans grew smaller, the tolls collected thinner, and the resources to maintain the deep wells and fortified walls gradually dried up. A that was no longer profitable could not sustain its own expensive existence, and one by one, they were quietly left to the wind. Political earthquakes on land could be just as devastating. The stability of the great empires was the invisible foundation upon which the entire network rested. The Mongol Empire, for instance, had created the Pax, a period of unprecedented security across Eurasia that made the Silk Road safer and more prosperous than ever before. But when that empire fragmented in the 13th century, the unified protection and administration it provided shattered with it. Routes that had been guaranteed safe passage for generations became contested zones between smaller, warring kingdoms. The cost of bribing local warlords or hiring ever larger bands of guards could make a particular desert crossing economically unviable. Trade routes would bend and shift to avoid conflict, leaving once vital stranded in a backwater of history, their purpose erased by a new line on a map drawn in a distant capital. The desert did not change, but the political landscape surrounding it did, and the caravans simply followed the path of least resistance and greatest profit. Perhaps the most poignant silence belongs to places that succumbed to a combination of these forces. The city of Palmyra stands as a majestic case study. Rising from the Syrian desert, it was not a simple stop, but a magnificent fulcrum of trade, connecting the Roman Empire with Persia and the East. Its grand colonnades, lush gardens, and towering temples were all funded by the tariffs on silk, spices, and incense. Palmyra mastered the desert, constructing elaborate aqueducts and cisterns to support its splendor. Yet its fortunes were inextricably tied to the political harmony between Rome and Persia. When conflict between these empires escalated, the route through Palmyra became a strategic vulnerability. Later, as Roman trade patterns evolved and maritime options improved, the city's economic reason for being slowly eroded. The maintenance of its vast water systems became a burden its diminishing revenues could no longer support. What began as a slow decline was likely hastened by conflict, until finally the great caravan ceased to come. The sand, patient and inexorable, began its reclamation project. Palmyra's fate was sealed not by a lack of engineering skill or will, but by a redirection of the global currents of commerce. Its breathtaking ruins are not just a monument to lost grandeur, but a stark lesson in the fragility of networks. A node, no matter how powerful, cannot survive if the flow is cut off. In some places, the land itself, its consent, sustained ecological pressure, often worsened by the needs of the itself, could trigger a terminal decline. The very success of a hub could plant the seeds of its demise. A growing population and constant demand for fodder for passing animals could lead to overgrazing of the fragile desert scrubland. Without those roots to hold it, the topsoil would vanish, accelerating desertification. Wood, a precious commodity needed for cooking and repairs, would be harvested from the few acacia trees until none remained. The microclimate of the oasis could subtly change, perhaps with a long-term shift in rainfall patterns, causing the water table to sink beyond the reach of even the deepest Qanat. The community would fight a desperate, generations-long battle against these trends, digging deeper, rationing stricter, and planting more drought-resistant crops. But there is a point of no return, where the energy required to sustain life exceeds what the station can possibly extract from the dwindling trade. The decision to leave would have been communal and heartbreaking, a final caravan not of merchants, but of residents, carrying their most precious belongings away from the only home they had ever known. Leaving empty doorways to face the advancing dunes, these silent skeletons in the sand serve as powerful reminders. They tell us that these networks were never permanent fixtures, but dynamic, living systems. They thrived on a precise balance of ecology, economics, and political will. It lived by the flow, and it died when that flow was redirected by a new maritime route, fractured by political collapse, or choked off by the very land it sought to conquer. Their ruins are not just archaeological sites. They are the fossilized remains of a global heartbeat that once pulsed across the deserts, a heartbeat that could be stilled by human ingenuity or human folly. This grand experiment in connecting a world did not simply end, however. It transformed, leaving behind a legacy that would shape the very concept of how societies stay linked, a legacy that asks us to look at our own modern networks and wonder what invisible flows sustain them. And what might happen if those flows were ever to change course? Buried beneath the dunes are not just ruins, but ledgers. For centuries, the stories of these desert hubs existed only in travelers' tales and fragmented manuscripts, more legend than history. Then, the trowels of modern archaeology began to turn the sand, transforming whispers into evidence. Each careful excavation peels back a layer of time, revealing the tangible, often intimate, reality of how these supply chains actually lived and breathed. The work is painstaking, a puzzle where the pieces are fragments of pottery, faded wood, and the subtle discoloration of earth where a wall once stood. Through this science, we are no longer imagining the Caravanserai. We are inventorying its storerooms and reading its mail. Perhaps no discovery captures this blend of myth and material proof better than the search for a city known as For generations, it was a name from folklore, the Atlantis of the sands, a fabled hub on the incense route said to have been swallowed by the desert as punishment for its arrogance. Its location was a mystery that tantalized explorers for centuries. The breakthrough came not from a lone adventurer, but from a fusion of ancient texts and space-age technology. Researchers cross-referenced historical accounts with satellite imagery, scanning the vast Omani desert for geological scars invisible from the ground. They identified strange, wheel-like patterns, the remnants of ancient caravan tracks converging on a single point. When archaeologists finally dug at that remote site, they found not a mythical city of sin, but a practical, fortified. The ruins revealed a large, octagonal fortress with towering walls and deep wells at its center. They unearthed rooms that clearly served as storage, workshops for repairing goods, and evidence of frankincense processing. Was real, but it was not a doomed metropolis. It was a critical logistical node, a warehouse in the wilderness whose fate was likely a combination of economic shift and that relentless enemy. A collapsing water table. Its discovery proved that the legends grew from a kernel of profound truth, the sudden, silent disappearance of a place upon which entire trade routes had depended. On the opposite side of Asia, in the parched Tarim Basin, another site offers a different kind of preservation. The ancient oasis on the southern Silk Road was abandoned so completely and so quickly that time simply stopped. The hyper-arid climate acted as a perfect freezer, desiccating and preserving organic materials that would have rotted anywhere else. Here, archaeologists have found wooden tablets inscribed with official orders, written in the script. These are not grand proclamations, but bureaucratic paperwork, a request for more camel fodder, a report on the status of a garrison, a legal dispute over a bolt of silk. They are the spreadsheets of antiquity, revealing the mundane administration required to keep the peace and the goods moving. Even more personal are the discoveries in the dwellings, the remnants of meals, discarded peach pits and wheat grains, and the stunningly preserved textiles. The fabrics tell a story of fusion, a local woolen cloak patterned with Hellenistic designs influenced by Alexander the Great's legacy, found alongside unmistakably Chinese silk. Each artifact is a data point. A scatter of coins from different empires maps the flow of currency. The seeds of native spices like coriander or black pepper, found in a hearth, chart the journey of flavors across continents. The very layout of a caravanserai, excavated stone by stone, shows the efficient flow of traffic, from the guarded gate to the animal pens to the secure storerooms at the rear. By analyzing the soil for chemical residues, scientists can now identify what was stored in those rooms, traces of oils, resins, or dyes that lingered for. This allows us to reconstruct the daily inventory of a hub, to understand that a inn might have held stores of jade from the mountains, bolts of Sichuan brocade, and sacks of dried Central Asian apricots, all awaiting their next leg westward. The archaeologist's brush does more than uncover objects. It decodes the rhythm of daily life in these isolated communities. It shows us the wear patterns on a threshold from countless passing feet, the repair on a child's leather shoe, the simple wooden toy left behind. These finds remind us that these were not just economic zones, but homes to families who raised children, mended clothes, and looked out at the same endless dunes, waiting for the next dust cloud on the horizon that meant news, goods, and connection. Each shard is a silent witness to the resilience required to not just survive at the crossroads, but to build a society there. The sand, which once threatened to erase all memory of these places, has become their most faithful guardian, preserving a frozen moment of a global network in operation. This physical evidence forces us to replace romance with reality, a reality that is in many ways more impressive, a testament to ordinary human organization on an extraordinary scale. Yet understanding the physical blueprint of these hubs leads to a deeper question, one that moves beyond pottery and into the realm of belief. What spiritual frameworks did these travelers and guardians carry with them into the emptiness? And what sanctuaries did they build to nourish something even more vital than their bodies? The silent stones of a tell one story, but the voices of those who passed through them tell another. While archaeology reveals the blueprint of these networks, it is the written word that fills them with breath and heartbeat. Across empires and centuries, travelers, officials, and merchants put ink to parchment or brush to paper, leaving behind a library of lived experience. These are not dry historical records, but urgent memos from the edge of the world, filled with the palpable relief of finding water and the sharp frustration of a corrupt toll collector. They transform our understanding from abstract logistics into the intimate, human rhythm of survival on the move. One of the most remarkable of these documents is a first-century sailor's guide known as the Of the Sea. It reads like a modern pilot's handbook, but for the desert coasts of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Its anonymous author, likely a Greek-Egyptian merchant, wrote not for kings but for fellow captains. He methodically lists the ports, the safe anchorages, and the distances between them. But more crucially, he notes where fresh water can be found, which local chieftains are trustworthy, and what goods are in demand at each stop. In one passage, he describes a place called Lyman, a harbor on the southern Arabian coast. He writes that it is a market for frankincense, and that the journey inland to the actual trees is guarded by the local people, a clear reference to the monopolistic control of the incense route. This is not history, it is real-time intelligence, a document meant to reduce risk and maximize profit for someone about to embark on a perilous voyage. It proves that the knowledge of these supply nodes was systematized and traded as a commodity itself, long before the first caravan set out. Centuries later, the voices become even more personal. The Chinese Buddhist monk in the 7th century embarked on a 17-year pilgrimage from China to India and back to obtain sacred Buddhist texts. His detailed account, later written by a disciple, is a masterpiece of travel writing and spiritual endurance. He describes the desert not as a blank space, but as a populated, if terrifying, landscape. He writes of following the bleached bones of men and animals to find the path, a grim trail of those who failed. His profound relief upon reaching the oasis of is almost tangible. He describes its lush vineyards and welcoming monasteries, a paradise snatched from the demonic sands. But he also notes the practicalities, the need for passports issued by local rulers to proceed, and the constant vigilance against bandits. His narrative stitches together the spiritual and the logistical, showing how faith moved along the same physical channels as silk, sustained by the very same wells and walls. From the opposite direction came the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, whose famous travels in the 13th century were recorded while he was a prisoner of war. His descriptions of the Persian and Central Asian deserts are filled with a merchant's keen eye for detail. He meticulously notes the distances between caravanserais, often measured in days' travel, and describes the system of post horses maintained by the Mongol Yuan dynasty, which allowed authorized messengers to change mounts at each station and travel with breathtaking speed. He writes of places where the water is bitter and causes illness, and of others where the local rulers are hospitable. His account, sometimes doubted but now corroborated by archaeology, provides a snapshot of the Silk Road at the height of Mongol unification, a time when the Pax made these journeys more feasible than ever before. He makes the network feel operational, a functioning piece of imperial infrastructure. But perhaps the most humanizing documents are the bureaucratic ones. From the Roman Empire, we have fragments of military logs and tax records found at remote frontier posts like in Britain, which offer a parallel to the administration of desert stations. These wooden tablets contain requests for supplies, reports on the health of troops, and even birthday party invitations. They reveal the mundane, daily grind of maintaining an outpost on the edge of empire. While not from a desert, they speak the same language of isolation and supply. For the desert routes, similar documents have been found, like the tablets from on the Silk Road. These are not grand imperial decrees, but local paperwork, a dispute over a debt of grain, a report on the repair of a well, an order for a soldier to escort a merchant to the next station. In one, an official complains that the assigned camels have not arrived, delaying a caravan. In another, a merchant lists the goods he has placed in a storeroom for safekeeping. These are the spreadsheets of antiquity, the unglamorous paperwork that was the true glue of transcontinental trade. They show that the system ran on accountability, receipts, and the constant, low-level negotiation of trust. A corrupt official could be reported, a lost load could be claimed, a price could be agreed upon in writing. These texts collectively do something profound. They return agency and emotion to the people of the past. We hear the frustration in a merchant's complaint about an unfair toll, the anxiety in a request for more guards, and the sheer exhaustion in a note that simply says the water is running low. They remind us that for all the grand scale of empires and economics, the network lived or died on the decisions of individuals in dusty courtyards, making calculations under a vast, uncaring sky. They were not cogs in a machine, but the conscious operators of a delicate and vital system. This written testimony completes the picture, giving voice to the silence left by the ruins. Yet these personal accounts and administrative ledgers point toward an even larger system of meaning, one that addressed not just the body's needs in the desert, but the soul's deepest yearning for protection and purpose. The desert well was more than a source of water, it was a portal to the. In the vast silence between caravans, where the wind sounded like whispered conversations, it was only natural that the human mind would populate these lonely outposts with beings of immense power. That fragile bubble of order became a stage for myth. Its life-giving spring might be guarded by a jinn, a spirit of fire and air who could grant wishes or lead the unwary to a shimmering mirage of doom. The safe arrival at a caravanserai after a sandstorm felt less like luck and more like the favor of unseen guardians. This blending of logistics and legend shows how deeply these places were etched into the psyche of every culture that depended on them. They were not just stops on a map, they were landmarks in a story about humanity's fragile place in a vast, animate world. Consider one of the most enduring narratives of all, the journey of the Magi. The biblical account of wise men following a star to Bethlehem is, at its heart, a story of desert travel. These learned astrologers, likely from Persia or Arabia, would have been intimately familiar with the real-world networks that made such a pilgrimage possible. Their guiding star provided celestial direction, but their survival depended on earthbound knowledge. They would have known the locations of the fortified caravanserais along the Persian royal road, the safe wells maintained by and the protocol for seeking shelter. The gifts they carried, frankincense and myrrh, were the signature commodities of these very routes. Their journey, framed as a divine quest, mirrors the reality of countless anonymous merchants, a testament to how spiritual seeking and mercantile travel were woven from the same thread. The "in this light" becomes a silent supporting character in a sacred story, the necessary earthly infrastructure for a heavenly revelation. In the deserts of pre-Islamic Arabia, poets sang of a magnificent lost city named of the Pillars, also called. Described as a paradise of towering architecture and immense wealth, built by a proud tribe called the Ad, its story always ended the same way. For their arrogance and corruption, the city was utterly erased by a divine sandstorm, swallowed whole by the desert as a warning to others. For generations, was considered pure legend, a moral fable about hubris. Yet, as we've seen, archaeological discovery suggests a core of truth within the tale. The real was a critical frankincense trading hub. Its disappearance was likely a slow process of economic decline and environmental collapse, perhaps culminating in a catastrophic sinkhole as its overtapped water table finally gave way. The myth takes this complex historical reality and crystallizes it into powerful, memorable poetry. The fate becomes a universal lesson, a symbol of how civilizations that forget their dependence on fragile resources, or that become greedy at the crossroads, can be reclaimed by the very wilderness that made them rich. The story ensured that even after the physical ruins were buried, the memory of the place and its warning lived on. These stories served a profound psychological purpose for the travelers. The desert was not empty, it was full of intention. Attributing a well to a jinn created rules for its use, fostering the respect and caution necessary to maintain the precious resource. Tales of cursed or vanished cities reinforced the social contracts and fair dealing required for trade to function in a lawless space. They transformed from a mere utility into a place of meaning. To arrive at one was not just to find water, but to step into a story that was older than the oldest caravan, a story that connected the mundane act of watering camels to the grand themes of divine favor. Human folly and the thin line between sanctuary and oblivion. This mythic layer provided a second kind of sustenance, feeding the imagination and strengthening the resolve to face the next empty horizon. It reminds us that the maps our ancestors followed were drawn not only in the stars and the sand, but in the dreams and fears they carried with them. A bustling port city and a silent desert outpost solved the same problem in opposite ways. Both were nodes in a global network, but where a port like ancient Alexandria thrived on abundance, in the Rub al survived on ruthless scarcity. This contrast reveals how geography dictated the very soul of these trading hubs. Alexandria was a permanent, sprawling metropolis, its deep harbor welcoming ships from 3 continents. Its famous lighthouse guided vessels by the hundreds, while its warehouses were monumental structures of brick and stone, designed to hold grain from the Nile, silk from China, and glass from Syria. The city itself was the market, a dense, noisy, permanent bazaar of languages and goods, supported by a complex civic administration, a standing army, and a diverse population in the millions. Its power was centrifugal, drawing the wealth of the world inward to a single, glorious point. The desert, by stark contrast, was centrifugal by nature. Its entire purpose was to push wealth through. It did not draw people to settle, it enabled them to leave. Where a port's infrastructure was built for storage and processing, a was built for throughput and survival. Its architecture was not monumental, but minimal and defensive. A single fortified gate, a central well, animal pens, and basic storerooms, all enclosed within high walls, that was the entire blueprint. There was no permanent populace in the thousands, only a rotating cast of merchants, guards, and the small, skilled staff who maintained the life support systems. The social complexity of a port, with its class structures, guilds, and civic institutions, was replaced by a temporary, flat hierarchy dictated by immediate need. The keeper's word was law because he controlled the water. Economically, their functions diverged completely. A port city generated wealth through manufacturing, taxation on a vast scale, and the constant churn of local commerce. A generated wealth through a toll, a simple tax on movement itself. Its entire economy was a toll booth economy, extracting value not from what was made there, but purely from the fact that people and goods had to pass through that specific, unavoidable point of scarcity. The value of a port was in its connectivity to many places, a web of sea lanes. The value of it was in its isolation, its monopoly over the one viable path across an otherwise lethal void. This is the core distinction. The port existed because of a geographical gift, a great natural harbor. The existed in spite of a geographical curse, a great unnatural absence. One was a celebration of what the world provided, the other was a triumph over what the world. Both were essential, but they operated on inverted logics. The port was a sponge, soaking up the world's bounty. There was a pump, forcing that bounty across a deadly gap. This comparison does not diminish the port's achievement, but it throws this into sharper, more astonishing relief. It was a machine built not for living, but purely for the act of passage, a creation that found its profound purpose only in the emptiness it was designed to defeat. The horizon was a liar. After days in the shimmering heat, the mind would start to betray the body, painting lakes of cool blue water where there was only blistering sky. For the desert traveler, the greatest enemy was often not thirst itself, but the hope of ending it. The psychological landscape of the journey was a treacherous terrain of its own, where the line between salvation and hallucination could vanish like a footprint in the wind. This is why there was more than a logistical solution. It was a sanctuary for the mind. Its existence was a promise that held the creeping terror of the void at bay. The simple knowledge that a specific well, marked on no public map but carried in the memory of a guide, lay exactly 4 days to the west, was a mental lifeline. It allowed a merchant to ration his last sips of brackish water, not with despair, but with calculation. The structured time itself, turning an endless, featureless ordeal into a series of survivable segments, each ending at a known point of human order. The moment of arrival was a sensory and emotional explosion. First came the sound, or rather, the profound relief from sound. The constant, maddening whistle of the wind across the dunes was suddenly muted by high walls. Then the smell, a shocking blend of animal musk, cooking smoke, and the damp, mineral scent of drawn water, a perfume of civilization after the sterile breath of the desert. The sight of other people, the bustle of activity, the green of a date palm frond, these were not just comforts. They were affirmations of reality after a world reduced to monochrome and silence. The traveler's first act was often one of quiet gratitude, a private ritual of thanks before the business of watering and barter began. This emotional resonance explains why these functional places were immortalized in poetry and song across cultures. The classical Arabic, or ode, frequently opens with a poet standing at the abandoned campsite of a lost love, but the imagery is drawn directly from the desert journey. He describes the traces of the campfire, the scattered stones of the hearth, and the memory of companionship, all metaphors born from the Caravanserai experience. There was the setting for reunion, for storytelling, for the exchange of news that connected a traveler to the world he had left behind. In Persian poetry, the Caravanserai is a common metaphor for the world itself, a temporary stopping place on the soul's longer journey. The great scholar and traveler did not just record distances and prices. He noted the quality of the welcome, the generosity of a particular keeper, and the beauty of a garden within an oasis. These details mattered because they fed the spirit. The fear of the mirage, that cruel trick of light and longing, made the tangible reality of the walls a psychological anchor of immense power. To pass through its gate was to cross a threshold from a state of perpetual vulnerability into one of temporary safety. Within, you were not a potential victim of the elements or unseen raiders. You were a guest, a participant in a shared, unspoken agreement. This transformation, from desperate wanderer to welcomed visitor, is what etched these places so deeply into memory. They were not remembered for their architecture, but for the feeling they provided, a fleeting but profound sense of home in the heart of nowhere. The fundamental logic of the desert was never truly abandoned, it was simply upgraded. Those high walls and deep wells have a direct descendant sitting just off a modern interstate highway, the truck stop. At first glance, the comparison seems whimsical, but the functional parallels are exact and profound. Both are nodes of pure necessity, placed at precise intervals along a lethal expanse. The desert was a void of sand and thirst. The modern highway is a river of asphalt and speed, but the human needs they impose are eerily similar. The ancient Caravanserai provided water, fodder, and a blacksmith. The modern truck stop provides diesel fuel, fast food, and a mechanic's bay. Both offer a secure place to rest, a chance to exchange information with fellow travelers, and a temporary shield from the dangers of the journey. The spacing is not random, it is calculated. Just as it was built a camel's maximum endurance from the last one, modern service plazas are positioned at roughly the distance a long-haul driver can legally and safely operate before requiring a break. The rhythm of the journey, a grueling push followed by a managed recovery, remains unchanged across the. This is not a coincidence, it is the rediscovery of a timeless logistical truth. To move anything reliably across a great distance, you cannot rely on the traveler alone, you must build a supporting lattice into the landscape itself. This principle scales to every level of modern infrastructure. The remote fueling station on a lone Alaskan highway, a tiny island of light and warmth in a frozen wilderness, is a direct echo of a fort in the empty quarter. Its existence acknowledges that the vehicle passing through cannot carry enough fuel to cross the void, so the void must provide it. The concept extends even to the most advanced frontiers of exploration. NASA's plans for sustained lunar or Martian outposts are, at their core, exercises in logic. A journey to Mars will take many months, a distance no single spacecraft can carry enough supplies to traverse in comfort and safety. The proposed solution, studied for years, involves pre-positioning supply depots in orbit or on the surface, caches of fuel, water, and food placed along the route by robotic missions. These are the ultimate caravanserais, automated in the cosmic desert, allowing human explorers to travel further by breaking an impossible journey into survivable, supported segments. The language changes from Qanat to life support system, from camel fodder to hydrazine fuel, but the strategic insight is identical. You conquer vast, hostile spaces not with a single heroic leap, but by patiently implanting pockets of resilience along the path. Recognizing this deep continuity reframes our understanding of progress. We often see history as a series of ruptures, where new technologies obliterate the old. But in the realm of moving things and people, the opposite is often true. The shipping container did not invent the idea of standardized cargo. It perfected a practice used for silk bales and amphorae. The global positioning satellite did not invent navigation. It automated the celestial knowledge of the desert guide. The internet did not invent the rapid relay of information. It electrified the gossip network of the Caravanserai courtyard. Our modern world of just-in-time delivery and continent-spanning supply chains is not a radical break from the past. It is the ancient desert network operating at light speed and global scale. The problems of distance, scarcity, and security are eternal. The solutions evolve in their technology, but their foundational geometry, the network of supported nodes, remains stubbornly consistent. This legacy is a humbling and powerful reminder. It suggests that the most enduring human innovations are not the specific tools we create, but the patterns of thought we repeat, the recurring ways we solve the basic puzzle of staying connected across the emptiness. Their survival was a daily lesson in living with limits. In our current age of climate concern, the ancient stands not as a relic, but as an unsustainable design for extreme environments. Every choice, from the thickness of the walls to the depth of the well, was a negotiation with absolute scarcity, a blueprint for resilience written in mud and stone. Their most sacred principle was the conservation of water, a practice elevated to a high art. The Qanat systems were not merely irrigation, they were a profound understanding of the hydrological cycle. By moving water underground, they defeated the desert's primary weapon, evaporation. In the Negev desert, archaeologists have found surrounded by intricate grids of low stone walls. These were not for defense, but for agriculture. They were designed to capture the scant overnight dew and the rare rainwater, channeling every milliliter toward the roots of hardy olive and date trees. This was precision farming in a place that received less than 4 inches of rain a year. Water was never used just once. Gray water from washing and cooking was carefully directed to nourish small kitchen gardens. Even the placement of buildings was calculated to provide shade and reduce the ground temperature, slowing the loss of moisture from the soil. This holistic view treated every drop as part of a closed loop, a circular economy of the most vital resource. The architecture itself was a testament to passive environmental control. The primary building material was the earth directly beneath their feet, sun-baked mud brick. This was not a compromise due to a lack of stone or timber. It was a deliberate technological choice. Mud brick has exceptional thermal mass. It absorbs the fierce heat of the day, preventing the interior from becoming an oven, and then slowly releases that stored warmth during the cold desert night, creating a stable, livable climate without any need for fuel. The walls were often incredibly thick, sometimes over a meter, acting as a giant insulator against the external extremes. The buildings were frequently clustered together, their shared walls reducing the surface area exposed to the sun and wind, while narrow, shaded alleyways between them created cooling air currents. This was bioclimatic architecture long before the term existed, using geometry and local materials to create comfort from the landscape itself. Nothing within was considered waste in the modern sense. Organic matter was meticulously recycled. Animal dung, collected from the pens, was mixed with straw and dried to become fuel for the cooking fires, conserving precious wood. The ash from those fires was then scattered in the gardens as a potassium-rich fertilizer. Broken pottery shards were not discarded. They were crushed and used as aggregate to strengthen new mud bricks or as drainage material in garden beds. Worn-out leather harnesses were cut down into patches for repairs. This ethos of reuse was not born from an abstract environmentalism, but from a stark, inescapable reality. Everything had to be brought in over immense distances at great cost, or it had to be endlessly repurposed. The entire settlement operated on a principle of near-zero waste because waste represented a dangerous depletion of finite capital. The ultimate limit, the one that governed all others, was the water table. A community's greatest achievement, its carefully maintained well or Qanat, was also its most vulnerable point. Historical records and archaeological evidence from places like the region show a clear pattern. The success of a hub could lead to its downfall. As trade increased, the population of the station and the number of passing animals would grow. The demand on the water source would intensify. If this drawdown exceeded the natural recharge rate from distant rainfall, the water table would begin a slow, fatal retreat. The well would have to be dug deeper, requiring more labor and better engineering. But there is a physical limit to how deep a hand-dug well can go. Eventually, the source would fall below reach, or become so brackish it was undrinkable. This was the ecological check and balance. That over-exploited its sole reason for existence was signing its own death warrant. Its longevity, therefore, was a direct measure of its ability to live within its means, to balance human ambition with environmental capacity. This is their most potent legacy for our time. They demonstrate that resilience is not about dominating nature with superior technology, but about aligning human systems with ecological boundaries. In an era of water scarcity and climate disruption, their example is a quiet, powerful argument for designing our modern communities not for endless extraction, but for intelligent, respectful integration with the limits of our local environment. They thrived not by conquering the desert, but by learning to listen to it. The keeper's wife was often the true architect of hospitality. While historical chronicles celebrated the daring male merchant and the fierce guard, the silent, sustaining rhythm of the was frequently conducted by women. Their roles were less visible to passing travelers, but were utterly foundational, transforming a fortified stop into a place that could nurture life, not just protect cargo. To understand these communities as complete societies, we must look beyond the bustling courtyard and into the hearths, gardens, and workshops where women's labor and leadership wove the social fabric that made long-term survival possible. In many cultures, women were the chief executives of domestic and food production, a responsibility of immense strategic importance. Managing the food supply for a rotating cast of hundreds was a logistical feat equal to any caravan master's planning. A woman, often the keeper's wife or a senior matriarch, would oversee the station's larders, calculating stores of grain, dried legumes, and salt meat against the unpredictable arrival of caravans. She directed the baking of hundreds of flatbreads daily and the preparation of vast communal meals. This was not mere cooking, it was large-scale provisioning, a role that required acute foresight. A miscalculation could leave travelers hungry, damaging the station's reputation and its vital income. Her authority in this domain was absolute, and her knowledge of preservation techniques, like drying fruits or salting meat, was a form of applied science that guarded against scarcity. Beyond sustenance, women were often the primary producers of trade goods themselves. In countless desert and steppe societies, textile production was women's work, and textiles were a universal currency along these routes. In the shaded arcades of a caravanserai, a traveler might see women spinning wool from local herds into strong thread, or working at looms to produce the very felt rugs, woolen cloaks, and saddle blankets that were staples of caravan life. The famous carpets of Central Asia, traded across continents, often began with the skill of women's hands in communities. They also repaired the textiles that came through, mending torn saddlebags or patching garments, a service as essential as the blacksmiths. In this way, women were not peripheral to the economy. They were manufacturing and repairing the physical infrastructure of the journey. The role of healer was another critical, knowledge-based position frequently held by women. In an isolated outpost days from any city, illness or injury was a constant threat. Women, as keepers of herbal knowledge passed down through generations, acted as the community's physicians. They would know which local plants could make a poultice for a camel's saddle sore, which brew could ease a merchant's fever, and how to set a simple fracture. This expertise blended the medicinal and the practical, directly impacting the health of both the resident community and the traveling workforce. A successful healer ensured that animals and people could continue their journey, making her role a linchpin in the operational continuity of the entire route. Perhaps most strikingly, in some desert societies, women held formal economic and social power that broader regional norms. The Tuareg people of the Sahara, who were indispensable guides and guardians of the Trans-Saharan routes, are a profound example. In Tuareg tradition, women were traditionally the literate members of society, preserving and teaching the script. They could own and manage property, including the crucial tents and livestock, and they played a central role in negotiating marriages and social alliances. A Tuareg woman's tent was the heart of the family's economic and social life, and her influence in community decisions was significant. This illustrates that societies were not monolithic. They could foster unique social structures where women's agency was recognized and essential to the group's success in a merciless environment. These combined roles reveal that the remote Caravanserai was far from a transient, all-male space. They were often full, functioning family units where children were raised and multi-generational knowledge was cultivated. A child growing up in such a place would learn a dozen languages from listening in the courtyard, understand animal husbandry by tending the pens, and absorb geography from the stories of passing traders. The woman managing this household was cultivating the next generation of guides, keepers, and ensuring the community's knowledge persisted. By centering their contributions, the history of these desert networks gains necessary depth and humanity. It becomes a story not just of roots and goods, but of homes and resilience, of the quiet, skilled labor that built oases of enduring order in the world's most formidable emptiness. The scent of cumin and wood smoke was a universal welcome. After weeks of hardtack and dried meat, the aroma drifting from a caravanserai's kitchen was a promise of civilization. These remote kitchens were not just feeding stations, they were the original fusion restaurants, where a merchant from N might taste his first olive, and a Persian traveler could discover the fiery kick of Sichuan pepper. The menu was dictated by two non-negotiable rules. It had to survive the journey to get there, and it had to nourish bodies pushed to their absolute limit. This created a fascinating culinary economy built entirely around durability and energy. The staples of the caravan trade were foods that could defy time and heat. Grains like millet, barley, and rice were packed in coarse sacks, their dry kernels immune to spoilage. Legumes, especially lentils and chickpeas, were a protein-rich treasure, lightweight and perfect for reconstituting in a boiling pot. Dried fruits were nature's candy and medicine, apricots from the valley, dates from Basra, and figs from Anatolia, their concentrated sugars offering a vital caloric boost. Nuts sealed in clay jars provided essential fats. Meat traveled as salted, rock-hard strips or as live animals driven alongside the caravan, to be slaughtered fresh at the journey's end. Every item in a merchant's pack was chosen for its shelf life and nutritional density, turning his luggage into a walking pantry designed for the apocalypse. Once these ingredients converged something magical happened in the communal kitchen. Cooks faced the ultimate challenge, feeding a small army of strangers with no advance notice, using only what was on hand. This pressure cooker environment became a laboratory for invention. Take the dish we know as pilaf. Its origins are lost to time, but its logic is pure caravanserai. Picture a massive, blackened cauldron over a central fire. Into it goes precious rice, a luxury grain along many routes. To stretch it and add flavor, the cook adds chunks of whatever meat is available, perhaps goat or mutton, along with diced onions, and a handful of aromatic spices a trader just sold from his saddlebag, cumin. Cinnamon, maybe some saffron. He pours in broth drawn from the well, and lets it all simmer into a hearty, one-pot meal that could be served to dozens. This was not haute cuisine, it was logistical genius, a way to create a filling, nutritious feast from scattered, preserved ingredients. The practice of cooking rice with spices and meat in a single pot likely evolved independently in countless kitchens from Persia to the Indus Valley, each version absorbing local influences, slowly coalescing into the family of dishes we recognize today. The real revolution, however, was in the exchange of the ingredients themselves. A storeroom was a botanical survey of the continent. A merchant from the east might trade a bag of peppercorns for some almonds, introducing a new spice to a region's palate. Citrus fruits, like lemons and bitter oranges, slowly traveled from their origins in Southeast Asia westward, their seeds carried and perhaps planted at Oasis gardens. Prized for their ability to prevent scurvy on long voyages. The humble carrot's journey is a classic tale. Originally a thin, purple root in Central Asia, it was selectively cultivated along trade routes, eventually reaching the Mediterranean where it developed into the sweet orange vegetable we know. Every transaction was a potential culinary landmark. A trader might demonstrate to an Egyptian merchant how to use fermented soybeans as a paste. A Byzantine traveler could learn to sweeten his wine with honey from the steppes instead of expensive imported sugar. These were not formal lessons, but the casual, life-changing sharing of knowledge that happens when people break bread together in a shared refuge. The menu, therefore, was the most direct proof of a connected world. You could sit on a rug in a dusty courtyard in Merv, eating a bowl of stew that contained Chinese ginger, Indian black pepper, and local lamb, served with bread baked from Crimean wheat. The meal on your plate was a map, its ingredients tracing lines across deserts and mountains. This constant, quiet exchange of seeds, spices, and recipes did more than fill stomachs. It gradually rewired the culinary identities of entire civilizations. The tomato would not reach Italy, nor the potato Europe, for centuries, but the framework for their acceptance was built right here, in these remote kitchens where necessity taught the world to share its harvest. The legacy of those shared fires is on our plates every single day, a testament to the fact that some of the most enduring connections are forged not by treaties or conquests, but by the simple human need for a good meal at the end of a very long road. A caravan carried more than silk and spices in its saddlebags. In the sweat of its animals and the breath of its travelers, it carried invisible passengers, pathogens that knew no borders. The same networks that delivered prosperity could also deliver a silent, biological invoice. With its crowded courtyard and shared well, was a perfect epidemiological crossroads, a place where microbes from 3 continents could meet, exchange hosts, and embark on new journeys with the next departing caravan. This was the dark shadow of connectivity, a reminder that the desert supply chains transferred not only wealth, but also profound vulnerability. One of history's most devastating examples is the Black Death. Most historians and epidemiologists now trace the spread of the 14th century plague pandemic along the very veins of the Silk Road. The bacterium pestis, carried by fleas on rodents, found ideal conditions in the grain stores of caravanserais and in the holds of ships connecting to desert ports. As merchants fled infected cities, they unknowingly carried the disease with them to the next oasis, where it would leap to the local rodent population and then to the new arrivals. The design to concentrate life in the wilderness inadvertently became an accelerator, turning a regional outbreak into a continental catastrophe. Yet within this same vulnerability, the network also cultivated its own defenses. Just as goods and germs moved, so did medical knowledge. There was not just a point of transmission, it was also a clearinghouse for healing. Traveling physicians, monastic healers, and local herbalists met in these spaces, comparing notes on symptoms and treatments observed across thousands of miles. A doctor from Baghdad might share a surgical technique with a Chinese acupuncturist, while a Greek medical text, preserved and translated in Persian centers of learning, could be discussed and its remedies tested with locally available herbs. The famed medical scholar, known in the West as Avicenna, compiled his monumental canon of medicine in the 11th century, synthesizing Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. A work that would become a standard text in Europe for centuries. This synthesis was only possible because the trade routes allowed such diverse streams of thought to converge. The practical medicine of the was often herbal and immediate. In the station's garden or in a healer's portable kit, one might find a vast on the move. Licorice root from the Mediterranean, used for coughs and stomach ailments. Rhubarb from China, prized as a purgative. Frankincense itself, beyond its ritual use, had anti-inflammatory properties. A merchant suffering from dysentery after drinking bad water might be given a tea made from dried pomegranate peel, a remedy known from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. This circulating knowledge created a kind of early globalized medicine, where a treatment for a fever developed in India might eventually find its way to a bedside in Cairo, because a trader had carried the recipe and the seeds. Perhaps the most fascinating adaptation was the informal, instinctive move toward quarantine. While the formal concept would develop later in Venetian ports, the logic of isolation emerged naturally in these remote outposts. If a caravan arrived with visibly ill members, the station's keeper, fearing for the health of his community and the survival of his business, might order them to set up camp at a distance, outside the walls. They would be provided with water and food left at a safe remove, a primitive but pragmatic barrier. Some larger may have had separate, isolated rooms or structures for this purpose, a practice born not from advanced theory, but from the hard-learned necessity of preserving the node so the network could continue. This represents one of the earliest forms of travel-related public health, a desperate attempt to filter danger from the flow. This duality captures the essential paradox of these ancient networks. They were amplifiers of both human genius and human frailty. They could spread a devastating plague across a hemisphere, yet they also disseminated the collective medical wisdom that might eventually combat it. They concentrated risk, creating hotspots for outbreak, yet they also concentrated the very knowledge needed to manage sickness, fostering an early, slow-moving dialogue between the world's healing traditions. The therefore stands as a monument to a fundamental truth of connection. To open a route is to open a channel for everything, the brilliant and the blight, the remedy and the malady. It forces us to see these hubs not as simple engines of commerce, but as delicate, living systems that had to constantly balance the immense benefits of openness against the perpetual risks it brought to their very door. The fortified gate of a was also a military checkpoint. In the vast, contested spaces where empires met the unknown, the distinction between a trading post and a garrison often vanished. These remote nodes became the nervous system of imperial frontiers, places where the flow of silk and the movement of legions were managed by the same sturdy walls. For empires like Rome and Han China, whose power stretched thousands of miles from the capital, controlling territory was less about holding every acre of sand and more about dominating the slender threads that made crossing it possible. Built at a critical oasis was not merely a service to merchants, it was a declaration of sovereignty. By garrisoning troops there, an empire could project its authority over hundreds of miles of surrounding emptiness without the impossible cost of a continuous manned border. The famous Roman limes in places like North Africa and the eastern deserts demonstrate this principle perfectly. These were not solid walls like Hadrian's, but linear frontiers of control, a chain of forts, watchtowers, and fortified. A Roman fort in the Syrian desert would have a deep well, storerooms for grain, and stables for horses and camels, serving both the merchant caravan paying its toll and the cavalry patrol heading out to scout for raiders. The two functions were symbiotic. The taxes from trade paid for the soldiers, and the soldiers' presence guaranteed the safety that allowed trade to flourish. This transformed the into a multi-purpose tool. It was a base for patrols that swept the surrounding dunes, showing the flag and deterring attacks on caravans. It was an early warning station, its watchtowers offering a view for dozens of miles, where a sentry spotting a suspicious dust cloud could light a signal fire to alert the next fort down the line. Most critically, it was a pre-positioned logistical node for the army itself. When Rome needed to send a legion deep into the desert to quell a rebellion or confront a rival power, it did not have to carry all its water and supplies from the start. It could march from one fortified to the next, drawing on the reserves stockpiled there. The stations well became a strategic asset, its grain stores a military reserve. This system allowed ancient superpowers to punch far beyond their weight, sustaining military campaigns in environments that should have been impassable. The Han dynasty employed a nearly identical strategy along the Silk Road. To protect the corridor, the vital artery into Central Asia, they established a chain of garrisoned outposts. Soldiers stationed at these remote forts were also farmers, tasked with cultivating oasis land to supply themselves and passing troops. A Han wooden slip found at such a site might record the number of arrows in the armory right next to an inventory of cloth bolts received from a merchant. The message was clear: commerce and control were two sides of the same coin. The empire protected the trader, and the trader's wealth and intelligence funded the empire's reach. This military dimension added a layer of grim necessity to this operation. The keeper now answered to a centurion or a Han commandant, as well as to the caravan masters. The secure storerooms held legionary javelins and stacks of army rations, alongside bales of silk. The peaceful transaction of the marketplace existed under the watchful eyes of armed men whose primary loyalty was to a distant emperor. This fusion made these outposts powerful instruments of intelligence gathering. Every traveler was a potential source of information. A merchant arriving from Parthia might casually mention troop movements he saw near the border. A nomadic guide could be questioned about the mood of tribes deeper in the desert. The keeper and the garrison commander would collate these fragments, sending reports back along the swift imperial courier system that used the very same network of stations. In this way, they became an ear to the ground, a listening post in the silence, funneling precious knowledge about the world beyond the frontier to the centers of power. Control of these nodes, therefore, meant control of the narrative. An empire that held the key could choke off an enemy's trade, blind them to events beyond their borders, and strangle their economy without ever fighting a major battle. It was a form of power that was subtle, pervasive, and incredibly cost-effective. The desert frontier was not a line to be held, but a network to be managed, and the fortified was the processor at every critical junction, deciding what and who would be allowed to pass. The desert was not only a path for merchants, but a road for the soul. For countless pilgrims, the journey to a holy site was the most important voyage of their life, a physical trial undertaken for spiritual reward. Whether bound for Mecca, Jerusalem, or the Buddhist centers of India, these travelers shared a common need with the silk merchant. They required safe passage across the same lethal emptiness. The that supported them, however, often operated on a different economy, one of faith and charity rather than pure commerce. This spiritual dimension transformed the simple caravanserai into a sanctuary, where the duty to shelter a weary pilgrim was seen as a sacred act in itself. Some of the most vital along pilgrimage routes were founded, funded, and maintained by religious institutions. A wealthy sultan, a devout noble, or a monastic order might endow a caravanserai specifically for pilgrims, offering free shelter, food, and water as an act of piety. In the Islamic world, this charitable foundation was known as a permanent endowment, where the revenue from lands or shops would perpetually fund the upkeep of the hostel and its staff. A pilgrim traveling to Mecca from Damascus or Cairo could rely on a chain of these endowed, knowing they offered a secure place to rest without the burden of a toll. The keeper of such a station was not merely a businessman, he was a servant of the faith, his role imbued with religious significance. His duty of hospitality was a direct reflection of divine mercy, and providing for the pilgrim was considered a service to God. Within these walls, the space itself was adapted for spiritual needs. Beyond the animal pens and storerooms, there was often a dedicated room or a quiet corner set aside for prayer. On the Hajj routes across Arabia, might include a simple mosque or a marked area for ritual purification before prayers. For Buddhist pilgrims traversing the Silk Road toward India, a caravanserai near a cave temple complex like those would provide not just physical rest, but immediate access to spaces for meditation and scripture copying. The journey and the destination began to blur, the itself becoming a minor sacred site, a place where the act of travel was. The scale of pilgrimage logistics is perfectly illustrated by the Hajj. For over 1,000 years, Muslims from across the world have undertaken the journey to Mecca, a religious obligation that created one of history's most sustained and organized movement of people. The routes across the Arabian Peninsula were meticulously serviced by a network of wells, reservoirs, and fortified shelters, many established by caliphs and sultans seeking to earn spiritual merit. Stations like Darb, a route from Iraq to Mecca, featured not only resting places but also milestones and even postal services to assist the pilgrims. Maintaining these water sources was a continuous, costly endeavor, funded by the state and by charitable donations, because ensuring a pilgrim's survival was a collective religious responsibility. This system shows how faith could drive and maintain complex logistical networks for centuries, independent of the fluctuations of commercial trade. A pilgrim caravan moved to a different rhythm than a merchant one. Its pace was set by ritual, its stops coordinated with prayer times, and its social cohesion forged by shared devotion. In the courtyard of a pilgrim, a scholar from Spain might break bread with a farmer from Persia, united by their common purpose. These spaces fostered a unique kind of community, temporary but intense, where stories of faith were exchanged, and bonds were formed that transcended language and origin. In this context, was more than a pit stop. It was an integral part of the pilgrimage experience, a testing ground of patience and perseverance, and a tangible expression of a civilization's commitment to enabling the journey of faith. It proved that the most powerful force motivating humans to cross the desert was not greed, but grace, and that the most enduring networks were often those built to serve something beyond mere profit. A single day without a caravan could dictate the price of everything. Within the walls of a remote, the laws of economics were stripped of all abstraction, reduced to the immediate, tangible reality of what was in the storeroom and who was at the gate. This was not an economy governed by kings or central banks, but by the desert's own brutal, fluctuating heartbeat. The value of a good was not what someone in a distant capital was willing to pay, but what the person standing in front of you, with dust on their lips and a fading hope in their eyes, desperately needed to survive the next 5 days. This environment created a marketplace of pure, distilled fundamentals, where price was a direct measure of local scarcity and human urgency. Water was the ultimate currency, but its price was never fixed. On a normal day, with the cisterns full and a steady stream of caravans arriving, a skin of water might cost a small silver coin or be included in the standard toll. But let a sandstorm blow for 3 days, trapping 2 large caravans inside and preventing any new arrivals. Suddenly, the consumption doubles while the replenishment drops to 0. The keeper, watching the water level sink in his main reservoir, faces a grim calculation. He must now ration not only for his permanent staff and their families, but for dozens of extra mouths and animals. The price for a refill of a water skin doesn't just rise, it can multiply tenfold or more. A merchant who balked at the price yesterday will gladly pay it tomorrow, because the alternative is watching his camels weaken and die. This was hyperlocal inflation in its form, a financial expression of a biological emergency. The same principle applied to fodder. A patch of unexpected rain might bring a flush of green scrub to a valley 50 miles away, lowering the value of the alfalfa stored in this loft. But if the next caravan arrived with half its animals limping from a forced march across barren ground, the demand for that same fodder would surge. The keeper became a master of real-time valuation. His prices a live feed of the ecological and logistical conditions for hundreds of miles in every direction. This made barter not just common, but often more sensible than coinage. A merchant from the south might have gold, but if the needed spare camel harnesses or lamp oil more, the gold held less practical value. The true market was a constant, silent auction of use. A trader could offer a length of sturdy cotton cloth from Egypt in exchange for a week's worth of dates and barley for his men. A skilled leatherworker, part of a caravan, might repair the station's well bucket in return for free lodging for his family. These transactions were multidimensional, valuing labor, specialized skill, and specific material needs over a universal monetary medium. Coins from empires like Rome or Persia did circulate, of course, often accepted at a negotiated value based on their metal content and the keeper's trust in their weight. But in the deep desert, the most reliable currency was often the trade goods themselves. A slab of Saharan salt or a packet of Chinese tea had an intrinsic, understood value everywhere along the route. They were commodities that could be eaten, used, or traded onward, making them a stable form of deferred payment. This system required and cultivated a deep, intuitive literacy in quality. Every merchant and keeper was an appraiser. They knew how to judge the purity of incense resin by its color and fragrance, the fineness of silk by its sheen and weight, the durability of a felt rug by the tightness of its weave. A negotiation was a rapid exchange of this expertise, a mutual recognition of value that had to be settled without formal contracts or courts. Disputes were resolved on the spot, often by the keeper's arbitration, because a caravan could not afford to wait. This created an economy built on reputation. A merchant known for offering fair goods at a fair barter rate would find welcome and better terms at the next station, his good name traveling ahead of him like a letter of credit. Conversely, a keeper who gained a reputation for price gouging during a crisis might find the caravans deliberately bypassing his station in future seasons, a death sentence for his business. The threat of this economic exile enforced a rough but effective ethics of fairness. In moments of true crisis, this entire framework could flip inside out. Imagine a scout stumbling into the courtyard, reporting that the next well on the route has collapsed. For the caravan that was planning to depart at dawn, this isn't just bad news, it's a revaluation of their entire world. The extra water skins they now need to carry for the longer, uncertain detour suddenly become the most precious objects in existence. In that moment, a merchant might trade a bolt of exquisite silk, worth a fortune in Samarkand, for just 2 additional full water skins from the keeper's emergency reserve. The silk is future potential, but the water is immediate continuation. This stark scenario illustrates the raw truth at the core of all economics, a truth often buried under layers of complex finance in our modern world. Value is not inherent, it is contingent. It is a relationship between a need and a resource at a specific point in time and space. There was a laboratory where this relationship was tested daily, proving that the most fundamental market force is not greed, but survival. And that the price of anything is ultimately just the measure of what we are willing to give up to keep moving forward. A blueprint could be more valuable than the silk it was wrapped in. The true wealth moving along those desert chains was not just the finished product, but the knowledge of how to make it. A caravan was a university on the move, its saddlebags filled with the operating instructions for new ways of building, crafting, and fighting. This slow, relentless transfer of practical knowledge from one Oasis workshop to another became the ancient world's most powerful engine of progress. Accelerating innovation across continents at a pace once thought impossible. Consider the quiet revolution of paper. For centuries, the classical world wrote on papyrus from Egypt or on cumbersome, expensive parchment made from animal skins. Then, around the 8th century, the technology for making paper from pulped plant fibers, a Chinese invention perfected centuries earlier, began its westward journey. It did not travel as a formal diplomatic gift, but most likely as a trade secret carried in the memory of skilled craftsmen, perhaps captured in a conflict or sought out by an inquisitive merchant. The knowledge would have hopped from one to the next, discussed in a Caravanserai courtyard, where a traveler from Samarkand described seeing the miraculous, lightweight sheets being made. By the 9th century, paper mills were operating in Baghdad, using the same basic principles of maceration, sheet formation, and pressing. This new medium was cheaper, more versatile, and far easier to produce in quantity than parchment, fueling an explosion of record-keeping, literature, and scholarship across the Islamic world. It was a classic case of acting as a relay for an idea, where the spoken description of a process was a cargo as transformative as any spice. An even more consequential transfer reshaped the very nature of warfare and society. For a rider on a horse, balance was a constant, precarious struggle, especially in combat. Then, from the steppes of Central Asia, a simple but profound device began to travel westward along the Silk Road, the metal stirrup. Initially a leather loop, evolving into a rigid metal frame, the stirrup gave a rider a stable platform. He could now stand in the saddle to wield a lance with devastating force, or twist to shoot a bow accurately in any direction. This was not merely an improvement, it was a revolution in mounted combat. The technology likely spread through contact with nomadic, employed as mercenaries or encountered by traders. A blacksmith at a frontier, repairing the gear of such a rider, would have seen the design, understood its mechanical advantage, and replicated it. By the early medieval period in Europe, the metal stirrup had arrived, where it would help catalyze the entire feudal system. As the cost of outfitting a knight with a heavy warhorse and armor created a new military aristocracy. A tool born on the Asian steppes had reconfigured the political landscape of a continent thousands of miles away, all because its design passed through a dozen remote workshops. The same networks transmitted the secrets of metal itself. Advanced metallurgical techniques for producing high-quality steel, like the famed crucible steel of India and Central Asia, known as Wootz or Damascus steel, were highly guarded knowledge. The resulting blades, with their distinctive watery patterns and legendary sharpness, were prized across Eurasia. The precise methods were a mystery, but the basic principles, the use of specific iron ores, precise carbon content, and unique heating and folding cycles traveled with the blades themselves. A skilled from Persia, meeting a metal trader from the Deccan Plateau at a caravanserai in Afghanistan, might barter not for finished goods, but for a verbal clue about the temperature of the forge or the type of ore to seek. This slow, fragmentary exchange of technical know-how meant that innovations were rarely invented in one place and kept there. They diffused, adapted, and improved. A ceramic glaze technique developed in China might inspire a potter to experiment with new colors. A design for a more efficient water-lifting device, the Noria, could move from the Roman world into the Islamic heartlands, where engineers scaled it up to irrigate entire oasis gardens. There was the research and development lab, where these ideas were prototyped in conversation. A carpenter from Byzantium could sketch a new type of wagon axle for a colleague from China, each absorbing elements of the other's design to solve local problems. This was open-source innovation on a continental scale, driven by curiosity and the universal language of craftsmanship. It meant that technological advancement was not a series of isolated sparks, but a slow, steady fire that spread along the tinder of the trade routes, igniting progress wherever the caravans paused to share not just what they carried, but what they knew. The silence of the desert made every sound within the walls a declaration of life. As dusk settled and the great gate was barred, they did not sleep, it transformed. The relentless wind, a constant hiss beyond the walls, was now a distant murmur, and in its place rose a rich, layered symphony of survival and community. This was the true soundscape of connection, a noise that would have been utterly alien in the empty miles just traveled. Close your eyes and listen. The most constant rhythm came from the animal pens, a deep, guttural chorus. Camels, those ships of the desert, communicated with low grumbles and groans as they settled for the night, their wooden saddle frames creaking with each shift of weight. The gentle, melodic clinking of bronze bells, tied around the necks of lead animals or prized horses, provided a soft, percussive backdrop, a sound that meant safety and rest. With this was the human tapestry. In one corner of the courtyard, a group of merchants, having shared a meal, debated the price of lacquerware in a rapid-fire dialect punctuated by laughter. A few paces away, a Persian trader haggled patiently in broken Chinese with a local supplier over a sack of millet, their conversation a dance of gestures and numbers. The blacksmith, working late by the glow of his forge, provided the metallic heartbeat of the place. The steady clang-clang-clang of his hammer shaping a red-hot horseshoe on the anvil was a sound of profound reassurance, a promise that the journey could and would continue. Then, cutting through the din at a prescribed hour, came the call to prayer. A muezzin's voice, clear and resonant, would rise from a small corner of the compound, chanting the adhan. For many in the courtyard, this was a signal to pause, to turn toward Mecca and perform their rituals, a moment of unified spiritual reflection amidst the commercial chaos. This call did not silence the other sounds, but layered over them, adding a dimension of sacred order to the practical hustle. As full darkness fell, the focal point of sound shifted to the cooking fires. Here, the tone softened. The crackle of burning dung cakes and the bubbling of communal pots provided a domestic soundtrack. This was the time for storytelling and music. An elderly traveler from the steppes might produce a small, two-stringed instrument called and pluck out a mournful melody about a lost love or a faraway homeland. A group of guards off-duty would share tales of narrow escapes from bandits or strange sights seen in distant canyons, their voices rising and falling for dramatic effect. The laughter that followed a well-told joke needed no translation. This auditory landscape was not mere background noise, it was the essential social glue of the network. In the sharing of song and story, trust was built, information was exchanged in a relaxed setting, and the immense psychological strain of the journey was momentarily released. The sheer variety of languages and musical styles in one confined space created a spontaneous cultural festival every single night. This vibrant, noisy, sometimes chaotic hum was the sound of the network functioning, of people from the ends of the earth finding common ground in shared exhaustion and shared purpose. It made the feel less like a remote outpost and more like the bustling heart of the world, a temporary capital of human movement. And then, as the fires burned low and the travelers retreated to their bedrolls, the soundscape would gradually simplify, fading to whispers, then to snores, and finally to the gentle sounds of resting animals. In those deepest hours of the night, the silence of the desert would begin to seep back over the walls, a reminder of the immense, quiet void that encircled this island of sound. That encroaching silence was the final, most profound sound of all, a sonic pressure that awaited the dawn, when the great gate would groan open once more. And the caravan would step back out into a world where the only sounds were the wind, the sand, and the steady plod of its own footsteps into the unknown, the coordinates on a map end where the sand begins. For every we have unearthed, countless others have vanished without a trace, their precise locations erased by centuries of relentless wind and shifting dunes. These lost nodes are the missing links in our understanding, the silent gaps in the continental conversation. Their disappearance is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a modern quest. A high-tech treasure hunt driven by a blend of historical curiosity and the tantalizing possibility of finding a time capsule from the age of caravans. The tools of this search have evolved from camel and compass to satellite and radar, yet the goal remains the same: to pull a whisper of order from the chaos of the desert. Orbiting hundreds of miles above the Earth, satellites equipped with multispectral cameras and radar can see what the human eye cannot. They scan vast, inaccessible stretches of desert, looking for subtle anomalies in the terrain. A straight line where nature creates curves, a faint rectangular shadow under a thin layer of sand, or a slight variation in soil moisture. These can all be clues to a buried wall or a filled-in well shaft. This bird's-eye view allows archaeologists to survey thousands of square miles in minutes, identifying promising targets for ground teams to investigate. It was this very technology that helped pinpoint the legendary, by tracing the ghostly lines of ancient caravan tracks converging in the Omani Desert. Once a potential site is identified from space, the next tool comes into play on the ground. Ground-penetrating radar is like giving the Earth an X-ray. Researchers slowly drag a sled over the surface, which sends radio waves into the ground. These waves bounce back differently when they hit stone, compacted earth, or voids, creating a subterranean map on a screen. Without digging a single hole, they can outline the footprint of a buried caravanserai, locate its central courtyard, or even find the deep, circular signature of a collapsed well. It is a way of listening to the ground, of asking it to reveal its secrets without disturbing the very history it has preserved. These modern methods are fueling projects across the old trade worlds. In the Negev Desert, researchers are meticulously surveying the incense route, trying to locate every minor station between the grand cities. Each small find, a scatter of pottery, a cairn marker, a hidden cistern, adds another data point, helping to reconstruct the exact pacing of that perilous journey. Along the Tarim Basin, where the Silk Road skirted teams use satellite imagery to combat the desert's advance, identifying sites that are being newly exposed or, conversely, swallowed by moving dunes. Racing against time to document them before they are lost again. What drives this painstaking, often grueling work? Beyond pure academic pursuit, there is the powerful allure of the untouched context. That was abandoned rapidly, perhaps due to a sudden shift in trade or a local conflict, and then sealed by the sand, could be an archaeological snapshot. Its storerooms might hold intact amphorae still sealed with their original contents, frankincense resin, peppercorns, or dyes. Personal belongings left behind in a hurry, wooden tablets with unfiled reports, even the remains of a last meal, could offer an intimate, frozen moment from a day 2,000 years ago. Finding such a place would be like opening a door that was closed in antiquity and walking straight into the bustling life of the courtyard. This enduring search, this marriage of ancient mystery and modern technology, is what keeps the romance of these supply chains vividly alive. It proves that our fascination is not just with the silk or the gold, but with the fragile human network that carried them. Every lost represents a story interrupted, a conversation cut off. The possibility that the next sweep of a satellite's eye or the next pass of a radar sled might reconnect that story, might hear the echo of a closing gate or the sigh of a resting camel, is a powerful testament. It reminds us that the desert still holds memories in its sands, waiting for the right question and the right tool to coax them back into the light. These silent outposts were never the final destination. Their entire purpose was to enable the journey, to make the next step possible. From the whispering sands of the Sahara to the windswept dunes of the remote desert stand as enduring testaments to human ingenuity and perseverance. We have walked through their fortified gates, seeing them as far more than simple rest stops. They were economic hubs where the wealth of continents was taxed and traded. They were cultural melting pots where languages, faiths, and recipes simmered together under a shared sun. Above all, they were lifelines of survival, where a single well's depth was the difference between a thriving root and a trail of bones. These fragile points, scattered like careful stitches across a vast and hostile fabric, are what sustained the mighty arteries of ancient globalization. They turned impossible distances into a series of survivable steps. Their true legacy, however, is not locked in the past. It is a timeless blueprint for overcoming distance and scarcity through community and focused innovation. The principles they mastered, creating nodes of reliability in a chaotic environment, investing in shared infrastructure, and building systems of trust to facilitate exchange are the same principles that undergird our world today. When you track a package moving across continents in days, you are witnessing the descendant of the caravan, moving through a digital and logistical caravanserai. When you video call someone on the other side of the planet, you are using a network that, in spirit, mirrors the information relay of the Persian royal road, just at the speed of light. Our modern grids of connection, from global shipping lanes to the sprawling internet, are built upon that same ancient, fundamental human need to reach one another, to trade, to share. And to know we are not alone in the void. The sand may have reclaimed many of these, but the pattern they established is etched permanently into how we organize our world. They remind us that connection is always a choice, a deliberate act of building bridges across the emptiness. If you found this exploration of hidden history fascinating, there are countless more threads to follow. Subscribe for more journeys into the past that shaped our present, and let us know in the comments below which ancient mystery or forgotten network should we uncover next. Your curiosity is the best compass for our next adventure.